In 1968, the largest private house ever built in America turned a profit of $16.24. Not 16,000, not 16 million, $16. A great-grandson of the man who built it announced the number to his family like a victory, because for the first time in the building's history, it had made more money than it lost. The house was Biltmore, 250 rooms of French Renaissance limestone sitting on a ridge outside Asheville, North Carolina. When George Vanderbilt opened it on Christmas Eve of 1895, it cost a fortune that the family has never fully disclosed. Spread across 4 acres of floor space, 11 million bricks, and a spiral staircase 4 stories tall. It was meant to be a country retreat for one shy, bookish heir who cared more about libraries than railroads. Within 20 years, he was dead, the money was draining away, and his widow was selling off 86,000 acres just to keep the lights on. What followed was a story about how a family holds on to something almost impossible to hold on to. A house so large it nearly bankrupted 3 generations, saved in the end not by Vanderbilt money, but by paying strangers walking through the front door at $2 a head. The Vanderbilt fortune began with a man who could barely read. Cornelius Vanderbilt, known as the Commodore, started with a single ferry boat in New York Harbor and built it into a steamship and railroad empire that made him the richest man in America. When he died in 1877, he left most of it to his eldest son, William Henry Vanderbilt, who doubled the money in the 8 years he held it. By the time William Henry died in 1885, the family was worth somewhere north of $200 million, and people like to say that 1 out of every $10 in circulation in the United States was a Vanderbilt dollar. George Washington Vanderbilt was the youngest of William Henry's 8 children, and he was different from the rest. His brothers ran the railroads and built marble palaces at Newport to show off. George read books. He spoke several languages, collected art, studied architecture, and showed almost no interest in the family business. As the youngest son, he received a smaller share of the estate than his elder brothers, though smaller in the Vanderbilt sense, still meant a fortune large enough to do nearly anything he wanted. What he wanted, it turned out, was a mountain. In 1888, George traveled to Asheville, North Carolina, with his mother. The town sat in the Blue Ridge Mountains and had built a small reputation as a health resort, a place people went for clean air and cool summers. George was taken with the views west toward Mount Pisgah, and he decided to build a house there. Then he decided to build the largest house in the country. He started buying land through a proxy agent so that sellers would not raise their prices once they realized a Vanderbilt was assembling an estate. Piece by piece, he put together a holding that eventually reached about 125,000 acres, roughly 200 square miles of mountains, farmland, and worn-out forest. He bought the small village of Best near the estate and renamed it Biltmore Village. The name came from De Bilt, the district in Holland where the family's Dutch ancestors had lived, joined to an Old English word for open, rolling upland. When word got out that Vanderbilt was buying, rumors ran through Asheville about what he intended. Some guessed a private park dotted with villas. Others thought a game preserve or a school for poor children. In October 1889, a wagon carrying a 5-foot scale model of the planned house rolled through the streets of New York toward the architect's office, and the speculation was over. The model showed a castle. The architect was Richard Morris Hunt, the most sought-after designer in America and the first American to train at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. Hunt had already built mansions for other Vanderbilts, and for Biltmore, he reached back to the great chateau of the French Renaissance, the turreted stone houses of the Loire Valley. For the grounds, George hired Frederick Law Olmsted, the man who had designed Central Park and effectively invented American landscape architecture. Construction began in 1889 and turned the mountainside into an industrial site. Roughly 1,000 workers labored on the house, including 60 stonemasons cutting limestone by hand. The estate ran its own brick kiln, producing the 11 million bricks the building required, along with its own woodworking shop. A 3-mile railroad spur was laid just to haul materials up to the site, because no ordinary road could carry the tonnage of stone and timber the project consumed. While the walls went up, George crossed the Atlantic again and again on buying trips, shipping home tapestries, carpets, prints, and furniture that ranged in age across 4 centuries. 6 years passed this way. The house was still not finished when he opened it. On Christmas Eve of 1895, George Vanderbilt opened Biltmore to his family and friends. What they walked into had no equal anywhere in private American hands. The house held 250 rooms and covered about 4 acres of floor space under a single roof. It had 35 bedrooms and 43 bathrooms at a time when indoor plumbing was a luxury, and much of surrounding Buncombe County still drew water from wells. There were 65 fireplaces. A grand stone staircase climbed 4 stories in 102 steps, spiraling around an iron chandelier that hung from a single point and held 72 electric bulbs, because the house was wired for electricity when electric light was still a novelty. The banquet hall rose 7 stories from floor to the peak of its ceiling. There were elevators, refrigeration, an intercom system, and central heating, machinery that belonged to the coming century more than the one Biltmore was built in. George had raised a working monument to the idea that a private citizen could live like a European lord in the mountains of western North Carolina, surrounded by the largest private forest in the country. He was 33 years old. He would get less than 20 years to enjoy it. The interior matched the ambition of the shell. George had spent his 6 years of construction roaming Europe and beyond with Hunt, buying by the shipload. He brought home 16th century Flemish tapestries, a chess set and gaming table that had belonged to Napoleon in exile, hundreds of prints by Dürer and other old masters, and a library that eventually held around 10,000 volumes in the several languages George could read. The banquet hall was hung with the tapestries and anchored by a triple fireplace at one end. There was an indoor swimming pool, a bowling alley, and a gymnasium in the basement, comforts almost no American home of the period could match. The house ran as a working household on a scale closer to a small village, staffed by dozens of servants who lived in their own wing and moved through hidden corridors and service stairs so the family and guests rarely saw the labor that kept it going. Every detail pointed at the same idea, that money and taste, applied without limit, could reproduce a European aristocrat's world on a Carolina mountaintop. The land itself became George's most lasting contribution, though it happened almost by accident. When he began buying, much of the forest around Asheville had been logged and farmed into ruin, the soil thin and the hillsides washing away. Olmsted told him the ground could not simply be landscaped into a park. It needed to be managed and restored over decades. On Olmsted's recommendation, George hired a young forester named Gifford Pinchot in 1892 and set him loose on the estate. Pinchot drew up a working plan to cut timber for profit while replanting faster than he harvested, the first attempt at scientific forest management anywhere in the United States. It worked, and it made George Vanderbilt the first American landowner to run a large forest on those principles. Pinchot went on to become the first chief of the U.S. Forest Service and one of the most important conservationists in American history. The German forester who replaced him, Carl Schenck, founded the Biltmore Forest School on the estate in 1898, the first school of its kind in the country. More than 300 of America's earliest professional foresters trained in those woods before the school closed. The site is preserved today as the cradle of forestry. A vanity project for one rich man had grown into the birthplace of an entire profession. In 1898, 3 years after moving in, George married Edith Stuyvesant Dresser, a well-connected young woman from Newport, who took to the estate and its community with real energy. 2 years later, in 1900, their only child, Cornelia Stuyvesant Vanderbilt, was born in one of the mansion's bedrooms. For a while, the family lived the life George had imagined, hosting long house parties, running the farms and forests, building schools and industries for local workers. The trouble was arithmetic. Biltmore had been designed as an English-style estate meant to sustain itself off its own land, but the land never came close to covering what the house cost to run. Operating expenses reached something like $6,000 a month, an enormous sum in that era, and after a national financial downturn in 1902, the family closed the house for a stretch and went to Europe to save money. Even a Vanderbilt could feel the weight of the place. George had spent freely on construction and on his endless art buying, and the estate that was supposed to be a self-running machine instead ran at a loss year after year. He began looking for ways to reduce the burden, including selling off large tracts of the forest he had worked so hard to restore. Edith made herself into more than a hostess. She learned about the farms and the forestry, took a real hand in running the estate, and poured energy into the surrounding community that depended on Biltmore for work. She helped organize a school and a program to teach local women domestic arts and crafts, and she supported the homespun weaving operation that became Biltmore Industries, giving Appalachian workers a market for traditional skills. When George died and left her holding the whole enterprise, that grounding is part of what let her act so fast and so shrewdly. Edith knew the place, knew its numbers, and moved to protect it the moment she had to. That moment came sooner than anyone expected. In late February 1914, George went to Washington, D.C., where the family kept a house, for a routine appendectomy. The surgery seemed to go well. Then, on March 6th, about 10 days later, a blood clot reached his lungs and killed him. He was 51. The news traveled fast and hit Asheville hard, because by then hundreds of local families depended on Biltmore for work. George left the estate and a $5 million trust to Cornelia, who was 13, with Edith holding everything together as the person actually in charge. What Edith inherited in practical terms was a beautiful problem. The house was worth a fortune on paper and drained one in reality. The taxes alone on 125,000 acres were punishing, and a new federal income tax had just arrived to make large fortunes harder to keep. She had a teenage daughter, a mansion the size of a small town, and bills that outran the income every single month. Within weeks of the funeral, she made the decision that probably saved Biltmore. She finished the sale her husband had started. In May 1914, Edith offered the federal government about 86,700 acres of the estate's mountain forest, the tract George had called Pisgah Forest, at roughly $5 an acre. The sum was so far below market value that it counted as a gift as much as a sale, and the government paid it out over time. That land became the core of Pisgah National Forest, one of the first national forests in the eastern United States, and it fulfilled George's stated wish that the woods stay whole and protected. The sale cut Biltmore down from 125,000 acres to a more manageable size, closer to the 8,000 acres the estate covers today. It lowered the tax bill and brought in cash. The dairy operation on the estate, meanwhile, had grown into a real business, selling milk and ice cream across the region. And for years, that dairy carried the cost of keeping the mansion alive. Edith had done the hard, unglamorous work of making an impossible house survivable. Edith ran Biltmore as a widow for more than a decade, and she ran it well, keeping the farms productive and staying close to the workers and the town. In 1925, she remarried to a Rhode Island senator named Peter Gerry and moved on to a new life, leaving the estate's future to her daughter. By then, Cornelia had married. In April 1924, at All Souls Church in Biltmore Village, Cornelia Vanderbilt wed the Honorable John Francis Amherst Cecil, a British diplomat serving at the embassy in Washington and a descendant of Lord Burleigh, chief advisor to Queen Elizabeth I. It was the grandest wedding the region had ever seen. They invited around 500 people to the ceremony and expanded the guest list to some 2,500 for the reception at the house. The couple settled at Biltmore and had 2 sons, both born in the same bedroom where Cornelia herself had been born. George Henry Vanderbilt Cecil arrived in 1925, and William Amherst Vanderbilt Cecil in 1928. For a moment, it looked like the dynasty George had imagined might actually take root, 3 generations of the family living in the house he built. That version of the future did not last. The Great Depression arrived and put pressure on everything, including a 250-room house that had never paid for itself. In 1930, Cornelia and John Cecil made a decision that would have been unthinkable to George Vanderbilt. They opened Biltmore to the public. Working with the Asheville Chamber of Commerce, which hoped the attraction would draw tourists and help the local economy, they began charging admission at $2 a head to walk through the family home. On the first day, about 300 people came. Within a year, close to 40,000 had toured the house. It was a modest sum against the cost of the place, but it pointed at the only real answer to the Biltmore problem, which was to let the paying public help carry a house no private family could carry alone. In 1932, the family formalized the arrangement by creating the Biltmore Company to run the estate as a business. The mansion, built as the ultimate private retreat, had begun its slow conversion into something closer to a public institution, one tourist at a time. Cornelia, though, had come to hate the life. She had grown up as the only child, rattling around 250 rooms, and as an adult she found the estate stifling. Around 1932, she left for New York to study art, then moved to Paris. In 1934, she divorced John Cecil, and she never returned to Biltmore again. She reinvented herself completely, changing her name, dyeing her hair bright pink, calling herself Nilcha for a time, and later Mary. She remarried twice more and lived out her years in England, telling almost no one about the enormous house where she was born. When she died in Oxfordshire in 1976, her ashes were placed in an English churchyard an ocean away from Asheville. Why she walked away so completely from the estate her father built has never been fully explained. John Cecil, for his part, stayed. After the divorce, he went on living at Biltmore, managing the property as a country gentleman until his death in 1954. The heiress had gone, and the house passed in effect to the Cecil side of the family, the sons she left behind. Through the middle of the century, Biltmore drifted. Cornelia's 2 sons, George and William Cecil, were educated in Europe and pursued their own lives before circling back to the estate. The house that had opened to tourists in 1930 kept its doors open, but visitor numbers were thin, the building was aging, and the money problem never went away. By 1960, the estate was losing about $250,000 a year, and there was nothing left over for the constant repairs a structure that size demanded. The man who changed that was William Amherst Vanderbilt Cecil, Cornelia's younger son. William had built a respectable career far from Asheville, graduating from Harvard in 1952 and working as a banker for Chase Manhattan in New York and abroad. In 1957, he married Mary Ryan, a Wall Street lawyer known as Mimi, who happened to be a first cousin of Jacqueline Kennedy. He could have stayed in banking. Instead, in 1960, William and Mimi moved to Asheville with a single stubborn goal: to save Biltmore by making the house pay for itself. William threw himself at the problem with an odd mix of aristocratic pedigree and hands-on hustle. He wrote his own marketing copy, took photographs for the estate's brochures, and looked for every angle that might pull more visitors up the mountain and keep them there longer once they arrived. The work was slow, and the margins were brutal. Then, in 1968, after years of grinding, William Cecil announced to his family that Biltmore had turned a profit of $16.24. The number sounds like a punchline, and William treated it almost like one. But it marked the first time in the building's entire history that it had earned more than it spent in a year. Everything that came afterward grew from that thin margin. Once Biltmore could make even a token profit, the logic of the whole operation changed. The house could fund its own preservation. Restoration could pay for itself by drawing more visitors, and the estate could stop bleeding the family and start standing on its own. What mattered about the $16 was the proof it carried, that the thing could be done at all. As the estate found its footing, the two Cecil brothers divided their inheritance along the lines of what each one wanted. In the late 1970s, George Henry Cecil, the elder brother, took the dairy farm and the thousands of surrounding acres, which at the time were the more profitable assets, and built them into a development and real estate company called Biltmore Farms. William took the heart of the estate, the house itself, the formal gardens, and the forests. It was a clean division of a difficult inheritance, and it let each brother chase the future he believed in. George's bet on real estate around a growing Asheville paid off well. William's bet was on the house, on the idea that a historic mansion could support itself through tourism if it were run with enough care and ambition. History would prove them both right in their own ways. But it was William's half that carried the Vanderbilt name and the building the whole story had been about. He now had full control of the mansion, and he was about to make his boldest move. In 1985, William Cecil opened a winery on the estate, built inside what had once been the dairy barn. He had started planting vineyards on the property years earlier and brought in a French winemaker to run the operation, at a time when the notion of a successful North Carolina winery struck most people as far-fetched. The gamble worked better than almost anyone expected. The Biltmore Winery grew into the most visited winery in the entire United States, pouring tastings for the same tourists who came for the house, and giving them one more reason to spend a full day and a full wallet on the estate. The same year, the family sold off the old Biltmore dairy business to a larger food company, closing out the operation that had helped keep the mansion alive through the lean decades and replacing it with something built for the tourism era. The estate was becoming a layered attraction, a great house at the center, surrounded by gardens, farm exhibits, shops, and now a working winery, each piece feeding visitors to the others. William Cecil retired from running the company in 1995, handing the estate to his son, Bill Cecil Jr., in far better shape than he had found it. When William took over in 1960, Biltmore lost money and looked to be sliding toward the fate of every other great Vanderbilt house, sold off or torn down. When he stepped back 35 years later, it was a thriving business with revenues around $32 million a year. He had done what he set out to do, and he had done it without selling the house or handing it to the government. William died in 2017 at the age of 89, and his wife Mimi died just 3 weeks later, ending a partnership that had rebuilt the estate together. Under Bill Jr., the company kept expanding, adding hotels, restaurants, and Antler Hill Village with its farm and winery attractions. Revenues that stood at $32 million in 1995 climbed past $200 million by 2016. The estate that once lost $250,000 a year had become one of the largest employers in the Asheville area, with well over 2,000 people on its payroll and more than 1.5 million visitors coming through every year. The survival of Biltmore looks stranger the more you consider what happened to everything around it. The Vanderbilts built at least 10 major mansions during their decades at the top of American wealth, palaces on Fifth Avenue and grand cottages at Newport that defined the Gilded Age. The family fortune, once the largest in the country, was scattered and spent within a few generations, and by the middle of the 20th century there was no Vanderbilt among the richest Americans. Most of the great houses were demolished or sold, their contents auctioned, their land redeveloped. Biltmore outlasted the others because of a decision the family made under pressure, over and over, to let the public in and to treat the house as a business that had to earn its keep. Cornelia and John Cecil started it in 1930 out of desperation. William Cecil turned it into a discipline. The house George built as the ultimate expression of private wealth ended up surviving precisely because his descendants gave up on keeping it private. The most recent threat came from the sky. In late September 2024, Hurricane Helene stalled over the southern Appalachians and dropped historic amounts of rain on western North Carolina, close to 30 inches in some places over a few days. The rivers that run through the Biltmore property, the French Broad and the Swannanoa, rose to levels no one had recorded before. The Swannanoa crested above 26 feet at Biltmore, breaking the old record by more than 6 feet, and the water tore through Biltmore Village at the estate's entrance, the same village George Vanderbilt had built for his workers more than a century earlier. The flooding wrecked the entrance, submerged cars, and swamped the estate's farm, where some animals drowned, despite the staff's efforts to move them to high ground. Biltmore closed to the public for the first time in memory. The estate set up a $2 million relief fund for its employees and the wider region. And Bill Cecil Jr. spoke about a family that had called western North Carolina home for more than 125 years, watching its region come apart. The house itself came through. Sitting high on its ridge, well above the rivers, Biltmore House took little damage, and the winery, gardens, and hotels were spared the worst of it. The damage that mattered was lower down at the entrance and the farm and out in the forested sections, where wind and water stripped the riverbanks and knocked down the old tulip poplars that had lined the approach road for generations. Crews cleared debris for months. The estate reopened in November 2024, a little over a month after the storm, in time for its Christmas season, and workers replanted and rebuilt through the following year. Biltmore had survived a financial crisis, a death, a divorce, the Depression, and now a 1,000-year flood, and it was still standing, still owned by the family that built it, still open to anyone willing to pay for a ticket. George Vanderbilt had wanted to build something that would outlast him and stay in the family for generations. He got his wish, though not in any form he would have recognized. What George Vanderbilt built and what his descendants managed to keep ended up meaning something none of them planned. He raised the largest house ever built by a private American to prove that a Vanderbilt could live like European nobility in the Carolina mountains. The house endured for a different reason. It survived once it began welcoming strangers, employing thousands, and paying its own way. The $16.24 that William Cecil announced in 1968 turned out to be the real turning point in the whole story, worth more than the 11 million bricks, or the 250 rooms, or the fortune that raised them. A house that big could only survive by opening its doors. More than 130 years after George moved in, it still stands on its ridge outside Asheville, and the people walking through it are the reason it is still there. Thanks for sticking with me all the way to the end of this one. It means a lot that you watch the whole thing. If you're in the mood for another, there's one right there on the screen that I think you'll like. And I'm creeping up on 1,000 subscribers, which is the point where YouTube actually starts paying me anything at all. So if you've enjoyed hanging out, know that every sub gets me a little closer.